Let's briefly go over the first five books again. We learned about the creation of the world. In the first book, do you know there are 66 books in the Bible? Let me remind you, there are 66 books divided into two parts. The Old Testament has 39 books, the New Testament has 27 books. Altogether, that's 66 books and 1,189 chapters. Out of the 1,189 chapters, 929 are in the Old Testament and 260 are in the New Testament. There are 31,102 verses in total. 7,957 of those are in the New Testament and 23,145 are in the Old Testament. For your information, the reason why three-quarters of the Bible is dedicated to the Old Testament is not accidental. In the Bible, there are two especially important books among the 66 in total, and all of them are good, but the key foundational book is the first book of the Old Testament, called Genesis, which has 50 chapters. Then there is the Gospel of Matthew, which has 28 chapters. The Gospel of Matthew is 28 chapters long, making it relatively longer than Mark, which has 16 chapters. Luke has 24 chapters and John has 21. We know this more or less. Now, is the Old and New Testament a separate collection or what? What have we learned? We have learned about the creation of the world, and the most fundamental book is called Genesis, especially its first two chapters. Whoever accepts these first two chapters without any doubt will find it much easier to read the entire book. As it is written in the very first verse of the first chapter, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, before anything was created, there was a being, God, and his attributes, his qualities are spread throughout the 66 books. So as we read, we are also learning about God's characteristics and nature in parallel. Who is he? Is he a person or just an idea? Liberal theology has removed the concept of God as a person from the Bible and presented him as merely an idea, giving him a global character and promoting religious ecumenism. That is why you see Muslims, Catholics, and others praying together. This is anti-biblical. This blasphemy is not right. It is not acceptable. God is a person, and as a person, God asks you to live according to the rules he has set. He created this world, this home, and he created it for humans, but ultimately he created everything for himself. Why? I cannot argue with that. Everything comes from him, belongs to him, and strives toward him. The Holy Spirit tells us this in the letter to the Romans. What information do we get from the first book of the Bible, from the origin of the world, the first two chapters? It can be divided into two parts, 40 chapters in total. This book consists of the first 11 chapters and then from chapter 12 to 50. Mainly we learn about the creation of the world, the entrance of sin. We become familiar with the story of the Garden of Eden, how sin entered, and then the first great catastrophe of humanity, what caused it, how it took on a larger scale. And up to chapter 12, we learn about the story of the flood. Here, one family continues, Noah's family, 8 people, who continue the reproduction of humanity, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And since then, humanity has never been globally destroyed again. So now, we ourselves, today's humanity, all of us, we come from Noah's family, from his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The multiplication of people comes from these 3 branches. The Semitic line, which is mentioned in the Bible, includes the nation of Israel and the Arab nation. And there are languages scattered across different continents, which can be a matter of debate. Some people consider themselves of Canaanite origin. Canaan was Ham's grandson, and Japheth is considered European. The majority of the population belongs to the Japhethite branch. As I mentioned, the Arab and Jewish peoples are Semitic, and the rest may have been distributed accordingly. Only God knows, but after Christ, this no longer matters. However, history has painted us the correct picture. In school history, they teach us that we come from monkeys, and I have some doubts about that. The nonsense about infusoria and the explosion and Darwin's theory, which claims that man came from apes. Even Darwin himself didn't really know what he was writing about. That book is no less religious and based on faith than on science. By the way, Darwin admitted this before his death, and Macreen heard about it. Yet these same absurdities are still taught in institutes all over the world, and his theory dominates. That's why things are the way they are for us, and all kinds of hardships are evident. So from chapter 12 to chapter 50, the book of Genesis is about one man, Abraham. Why do I mention this? We'll encounter this again in the Gospel of Matthew. The book of the birth of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, the son of David. See, the son of Abraham, the son of David. We will begin a detailed analysis of this, and I will provide you with a lot of information about it. This genealogy is quite interesting and has many intricacies. We encounter genealogy in Genesis as well in chapter 5, right in the very first verse of chapter 5, and we also find it in the New Testament. At the same time, we have already become familiar with the entire 9-generation history of descendants from Adam onward, friends, if you remember. So starting from chapter 12, we learn how Abraham was called, and from Abraham came his son Isaac, then Jacob, then Joseph, the history of the 4 patriarchs. From one man, we get one family, then Jacob's grandson, and then how from this a nation is formed, from a people, Eber, that is in the list, the Hebrew, Esau, and then how these 70 souls enter Egypt, and for 430 years God remains silent, just as he does from Malachi onward. It was 400 years of silence, and the Old and New Testaments both reflect this, as if heaven had closed its mouth and there was no information at all. After 430 years pass, while Moses is in exile, the second book opens with this. During Moses' exile, a strange event catches his attention. He sees in broad daylight a burning bush that is on fire but is not consumed. There is fire, and the sight amazes him. This was the arrival of a supernatural miracle, something beyond nature. At this time, Moses is 80 years old. And don't confuse being 80 back then with being 80 today. Back then, an 80-year-old man would still be carried in people's arms, still strong. He's a very strong man. That's probably how Michelangelo imagined Moses when he sculpted him from marble. Moses was amazed, got up, and approached. Nothing was burning, and then he heard a voice. The heavens opened, and he was spoken to. What happened? We've learned this, how Moses was given his mission, how he resisted, frightened, yet faithful. But what was happening in Moses' consciousness during those 40 years in the desert? We don't know. I only know that he had a family. He started a family. He had a wife and a child. And as a shepherd, this man who was raised in Pharaoh's court, who was almost being prepared to become Pharaoh himself, the one who was adopted, he became a shepherd. The first shepherd in history was Abel, as we know. He was a herdsman, Cain's brother. This too carries symbolic meaning. In the Bible, shepherding in general has great significance, and the greatest shepherd is Jesus Christ. It's a good comparison. A shepherd is someone who is compared to the faithful, to the sheep, not to be taken literally. Moses was sent there and he led his people out. We've already learned about this in 3 or 4 books of history. How does God shape them? How does he form this chaotic mass of 2.5 million people? What kind of offspring did this family have over 430 years? And then after all the suffering and hardship, they come out of bondage. Now 2.5 million people need a place, right? And the promised land is prepared, the one God promised to Abraham, which was passed down to Isaac, then to Jacob. We learned about the fulfillment of this. Then we learned about the giving of the laws. Here we studied Leviticus, about worship, and in Deuteronomy we studied many things. Then we covered the historical books, and even those were included. How did they conquer the land? They enter, and that's the Old Testament, which is mentioned in both the Old and New Testaments on Mount Sinai, and how Israel cries out, "We will fulfill this." What is this resurrection? Now, there is a covenant which implies obligations for both parties. One party takes on the responsibility to fulfill it. When God made a covenant with Israel, God fulfilled his part, but they did not. That's why he annuls the law, the covenant made with your ancestors, because you could not keep it. Oh, I am annulling it, and I will make a new covenant. We read that this new covenant will now be written in your hearts and minds. I will write it, and I will be your Lord, and you will be my children. This is then repeated in the books of the New Testament in what is called the letter to the Hebrews. This term is not a technical term. It is a contract, a mutual agreement, an agreement, and both parties must fulfill it. The people of Israel could not fulfill it, and that's where the problems with the covenants began. We learned about these problems in the books of Kings and in the parallel accounts, and this is exactly where we stopped, how the kingdom was divided in two in 722 BC. Assyria conquered the 10 tribes of the people of Israel, what is called the northern kingdom. However, for 209 years, God watched over them and did not say anything. Out of 9 dynasties, there were 19 kings, reckless and headstrong, who destroyed and annihilated the state, and civil wars began. It was split into 2. This happened in 922 BC, when after Solomon, his foolish son Rehoboam ascended the throne, and on the other side Jeroboam opposed him. We have also learned this in terms of recalling everything, and then we followed the rise and fall, the gradual spiral of decline, and what caused it. It was caused by idolatry. The northern kingdom separated from the southern kingdom, and even in the southern kingdom, if you know geographically and historically, the people of Israel are stretched from north to south, not from east to west, but from north to south. That is how it is situated territorially, and they were not able to expand this promised territory. The kings of Israel came for a simple reason. They felt the urge, they did it, and they allowed the worship of pagan gods on their territory. This is still very relevant today. You should know there is nothing new under the sun. Nothing that happens is new. God told this to the church. As a result, as I mentioned, after 209 years, in the year 722, the northern kingdom was abolished and exiled. They went away and were scattered. What remained was the southern kingdom, which lasted for 344 years, starting from the year 931. Of course, I mean the old calendar, the cessation of existence as a state entity in 586 BC, and this also led to competitions. We have also studied this history, especially when we finished the second book of Kings, which in a certain sense was seen from a divine perspective. What we learned from a secular perspective, we saw in the books of Kings, especially the third and fourth books of Kings. Here we paused. An emotional reader might feel a bit sad that both of these states disappeared and were taken into captivity. They went into exile. Jeremiah bids them farewell with tears. The famous lamentations of Jeremiah are also in the Bible. Let's pause here. Now, the last prophet, Malachi, is active in this era. Nehemiah and Malachi are both working during this time. Malachi is the one who prophesies the coming of John the Baptist, the forerunner, meaning he precedes the Messiah. The person of Jesus Christ comes after him with a difference of 6 months. 6 months separate Jesus Christ and John. John prepares the way for him and begins the baptism of repentance. These are the prophets before Malachi, and as I mentioned, Malachi is from 400 BC. Here is where the history of the Old Testament ends. Now, if we try to establish a chronology, though it's somewhat approximate, friends, and based on the Bible, I can tell you that from the creation of the world to the flood is 1,656 years. However, in some places, 2,000 years is mentioned for the flood. 2,000 years is enough time for significant human reproduction, especially under good conditions and with long lifespans. You know that the ancient patriarchs lived 930, 950, 966 years. So people lived for 500 or 600 years like that. But then, as sin spread throughout history, as a result, the lifespan gradually decreased and started to decline to 120, 110, 147, 175 years, and then later to 60. When we get to the history of the kings, which is around the 10th or 11th centuries BC, the kings' lifespans are already very short. David lived 70 years, and some lived around 60 years. Solomon and the others, some lived 50, 55, 10, or 20 years. Lifespans shrank even more. Today we are at about the same level. No one on earth lives to be 150 years old. Maybe somewhere we might find a last Mohican who reaches 105 or 110 years. I don't know. But now that would be a truly unique case. But even then, their mind probably doesn't function, and nothing else works either. They would be non-functional. The biblical age for a human life was set at 70 years, and if one is healthy, then 80 years. If someone at that age still retains their faculties, can speak and so on, beyond that, if an elderly person can talk without making mistakes, that's a rarity. For example, in Georgia, there's Nodar Natadze at 89 and Mariam Lord Kipanidze at 90. When they speak, they still talk. Sometimes people don't call it great wisdom, but it's still pleasant. People of that age aren't led by the hand, and they don't trouble a group of 5 people like an army. Shiolashvili, for example. These people sit and talk, have good memory. Maybe their hearing is a bit diminished, but that's the maximum. But people of such age and condition, there aren't any left, not just in Georgia, but anywhere. Time thinks just a little, you see. This is the result of a sinful nation, my friends, and it's very sad. A person lives only a short while. We spend our lives in foolishness, and then suddenly we look back, and 60 years have passed behind us, and we realize how many things we still have left to do, how much we didn't manage to accomplish. We don't have time for love, for our loved ones. The phrase, "I don't have time," has appeared. Wives don't have time for their husbands. Everything has shrunk. Both don't have time. Young people don't have time for each other. Some are here, some are gone, some are just in the wind. Relationships are now through computers. We're in a completely different dimension. Stress is a puzzle. After all, as a result of collective stress, people either take medication or, if they don't, they bark. We live on a planet of barking dogs. Forgive me for the comparison, but what can we do? Sometimes we have to describe our dirty nature this way, otherwise we won't understand the grace of Christ. So, after Malachi, the heavens were silent, nothing was announced, nothing happened, and then suddenly the doors opened. Why did I say the main book is the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew? Because there we see that the book begins with the birth of Jesus Christ. What was happening during those 400 years? I'll tell you that too, so you have the information. Maybe the timeline will interest you, and you'll look it up later. So, in the East, there were 3 powerful empires that dominated the world. These were Assyria, Babylon. This is what we learn, and what happened in relation to Israel we studied. The Assyrian Empire lasted 120 years, then Babylon, the Second Babylonian Empire, lasted 70 years, and then Babylon itself was conquered by the powerful Persian Empire, and this was in the East. The most influential state in terms of power, but Egypt was still a force to be reckoned with. Egypt was not yet on its last legs, and we stopped there. So we left off with Israel under Persian influence, with Persia ruling the then known world, and its territory being vast, dominating the East in this regard. In 480 BC, Xerxes, the king of Persia, defeats Greece, but under the same pattern. At Thermopylae, the Greeks are defeated. This is when the West starts to challenge the East, and the question arises, who will take first place among these powerful empires? Which new empire will emerge? The prophecy of the new empire is found in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, which we will study in detail later. As we mentioned, in 480 BC, Xerxes defeats Greece at Thermopylae, but is defeated at Salamis. These battles are historically well known, and in 333 BC, from the west comes the power described as the horn of a goat. This is Alexander the Great, called the Great, who, while still very young and with united forces, defeats Persia. Thus a new ruling system emerges, the Greek civilization. Power shifts from the east to the west. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great enters Jerusalem, and this prophecy is fulfilled. He does not destroy Jerusalem. They bring him the book of Daniel and tell him, "Here it is, written about you." It all comes to a halt in 323 BC When Alexander the Great dies, his empire is divided among his four generals, and Israel as a nation passes from one hand to another. This is the period, as I mentioned, the 400 years, what was happening historically before we opened the door to the New Testament. What historical events preceded it? As we noted, the heavens are silent. Nothing is written. When the Old Testament ends, even though it is a divinely inspired book, God no longer gives anyone instructions to write anything. Here the last is Malachi. After Alexander's death, his four generals divide his empire, and this is how the West, with its sword and shield, came to dominate rather than the East. But after Alexander the Great, the empire broke apart and was divided. In that region, Syria rose to prominence, the Seleucids. So, what was the fate of the people of Israel? Israel was conquered by the Seleucids and came under their rule. In 166 BC, there is a revival once again. With a certain national spirit, Israel rises up in rebellion, led by Judah Maccabee. Maccabee means hammer. As a result, they celebrate victory, and from the dynasty of the Maccabees, the last king is Antigonus, whom Herod kills and then becomes king himself. But I'll skip over some periods so you don't get lost. In 63 BC, Pompey conquers the region. Rome had become powerful by then. In 31 BC, Augustus is in power, and in 44, the Senate grants Herod the title. This is the first great Herod, the one mentioned in the Gospels. He is appointed as the king of Israel, but note that Herod's origin is Idumean. Idumea is Edom, so he is a descendant of Esau. Just look at the state the people of Israel had fallen into, a real tragedy. He was a terrible person, showed no mercy to anyone, was extremely jealous, and wouldn't let anyone take his place, even killing his own children. Well, that's a whole story in itself, and I won't tire you with all the details. In 4 BC, it is under such circumstances that Jesus Christ is born around the year 0. For 104 years, what was happening culturally and politically? During this 400-year period, four influential parties emerged: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Scribes, and the Herodians. It is within this context that we now find ourselves in the New Testament, a depressive historical background that we should imagine, otherwise we won't understand everything that follows. For example, the heavens opened, and the evangelist Luke tells us that Zechariah, while standing at the altar during a service in Jerusalem, the angel gives him the message, even though they are both advanced in age and have no children. He tells him, "You will have a son, John the Baptist." This is the moment when the voice is heard, the heavens open, and the records of the New Testament begin to be written. It is precisely in this era that the entire history of the 27 books is written. There are 40 years in the new era, and to give you an approximate timeline from year 40 to 90, somewhere in the first century, all of this comes to an end. The last book is Revelation. I also told you that the New Testament consists of 27 books, 4 Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, 14 letters, though some attribute 13 to Paul. I consider there to be 14. And not only that, but also 2 letters of Peter, and then, as you know, others as well. I don't want to rush through this now. What I want to tell you is that the main book in the New Testament is the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew is unique, first of all, because without considering the Old Testament, we cannot understand the scattered quotations in this book, when and in what context Matthew, inspired by the Holy Spirit, uses them. This tax collector, Matthew, yes, the tax collector who, in chapter 8, calls himself unworthy in his own book, in chapter 9, verse 9. Let's make this topic interesting so that in some way you come to love this book, because for many it is close to their hearts, and I'll tell you why. I myself once held it close to my heart, and when I first opened the Gospel, the genealogy in Matthew caught my attention. Except for Luke, no other Gospel contains a genealogy. You won't find it in Mark or John. I'll explain separately what purpose it serves, and if we find this key. The key is in the genealogy. Chapter 9 is beautiful to read. And what is the significance of this genealogy? Why does the book begin with the book of the birth of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, the son of David? The Gospel is unique in that it contains over 600 citations from the Old Testament. Nowhere else are there so many Old Testament references, not even in the Reign. Next, it's interesting. Why are there four Gospels? Because they are sent to the four corners, to four civilizations. Matthew is for the Jews, for the people of Israel. Mark is for the Romans, the Roman Empire at that time. Luke is for Greek civilization, and John is for the Eastern mystical philosophy for that sphere. We will cover each of these separately later. As I said, there is a lot to talk about, but I don't want to tire you out.